There are two extremely high probability setups here brewing for Bitcoin, which are very likely to play out and also going to create some pretty nasty price action, I do suspect, over this next coming week or two. Without further ado, we'll get into it, starting off as always with some good old price action statistics, and then go over those setups and what they likely mean and what sort of traps to avoid from this. Anyways, first things first, looking at Thursday, we are actually on the most likely day to close negatively out of any weekday since this bull market began in 2023, with over 55% of all Thursdays closing negatively. So again, it's not like 100%. 55 is certainly the highest one though, to close negatively. But as always, we're most interested in the average percent gain and the average percent loss for Thursdays in particular. And to the downside, that would create an area of interest, or a boundary, as we like to say, at around 108, 830-ish region. So if you do see a wick down around there, probably would be looking for a bit of a bounce on the first pass. And same thing to the upside. If Bitcoin were to trade up to about 112, 900, 113-ish region, I would be looking for a pullback again on that first pass. We've seen this play happen so many damn times. Again, for those short-term time frame scalpers, I think that this indicator, this script, is just a fucking gold mine, to be honest with you. And you can actually try it out for free in the link description below for Caretaker's indicator suite. It's the historical price action statistics indicator. It comes a part of that, which includes actually all of Caretaker's amazing creations. But yeah, as far as Thursdays goes, I mean, you might even argue that we've kind of already seen that bottom boundary tested right here, as Bitcoin has already bounced up like more than $10,000, more than $1,000, actually closing in about 1,500 or so. So I'm not necessarily certain I would take the second test down around there. But here's the thing. This is all secondary to the mega setup that I think is really brewing in the background here. Now, I think that there's a couple of ways that this can likely come about. So I'm going to, I need to be super nuanced in this video to explain this, because it's going to be really, 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 really important that you understand all facets and all moving parts of this, because it really does matter what essentially happens first. Although I do think that there is one side that is, or, a scenario that is significantly more likely to happen rather than the other side. But we'll go over both, and we'll start it off over here with the daily HPDR for Bitcoin. So if you've been following this channel, you've seen this setup in the past before, where we see an outsized move where Bitcoin trades well far away from that median on the HPDR. And when that happens, it creates a really beautiful setup where we have the potential to have an extremely high probability play for price action to find its way back to that median when volatility starts to contract. Now, we're going to be using the BBWP indicator to measure volatility, and this one's already started to contract as of earlier this week. And whenever that happens, that typically suggests that whatever the lowest price in this case was traded before is unlikely to be traded below. So that would be basically Friday's low, right? Friday's low, or last Friday's low, I should say, which was about 105 or 107, depending upon your exchange. And, basically just this sort of price action that we saw right here. And we've seen Bitcoin dip into this region a few times now. And thus far, it's been holding valiantly above. So I do think that this is more likely to happen first, in the sense that as we already have volatility contracting right here with the BBWP coming down, we're very likely going to see a bounce somewhere to fulfill a test of that median. Now, the median on the daily will obviously update each and every passing day. So naturally, it will come down here, maybe even aggressively as well. As of right now, though, it is about 123,000 US dollars. I highly doubt it's going to stay up there while Bitcoin makes the retest. It's very likely to come down significantly. I would imagine somewhere around 118-ish region, give or take a little bit from that number. And then the key point here is that when you see Bitcoin test that median, that would effectively fulfill that condition being true, meaning that we've seen the bounce play out. And there are some major implications with this being, quote unquote, just a bounce, because we do actually have setups going a little bit lower as of right now. So again, that's going to be in the background. That's going to be a bounce target for whenever Bitcoin does decide to bounce. I would suggest that Bitcoin's unlikely to make significantly new lows below what we've seen this week before playing out a bounce. How high can the bounce come? Again, I highly doubt it's going to remain up here. Probably comes down somewhere around to like 118 if I had to guess. But we'll have to see if and when that does happen. Now, here's the thing. While we wait for this bounce, I do want to also come up with some areas of interest for those for the bounce target. And if we were to draw a Fibonacci retracement using the high of Bitcoin to the low of this current move, we can see that the 618 is coming in around about 120, a little bit closer to 120. The 50% retracement level is about 118. So I'd imagine somewhere within this vicinity right here, that is very likely going to be a bounce and fulfill that condition. Now, here's the thing. we do have another one of these moving average setups, the corrective setups that we've gone over many times on this channel. In fact, I forgot to bring it up on this, but I can assure you we once again have one here. So here's why I think the bounce is very likely going to be a trap. The reason why is because the 4-day time frame setup has fired off again. We've seen that red moving average cross the underside of the yellow moving average. And every time that we've seen that over the past 8 years, it has led to a test at minimum of the green moving average. We've seen it many, 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 many times. By the way, I'm using the Quant Prime service over here to back test this idea. You can obviously try this out for free for 7 days as well and set up all of the strategies that you ever wanted to and more in there. But anyways, for directional analysis, I really like to use this particular setup. And yes, as of last night's fresh closure, we have seen this fire off yet again. So this does not mean Bitcoin's going to come down to test that green 55 immediately. It doesn't necessarily imply that it's going to happen sooner rather than later. It just implies that it is going to happen, just like we saw over here most recently, where it fired off in early September and didn't actually fulfill the test of the green moving average until early October. And in between there, Bitcoin put in a pretty big rally, right? It rallied around those prior highs, made a slightly new high on a week basis. So here's the thing. If Bitcoin bounces first, which I think it actually is likely to bounce first because of the HPDR setup over here, then we have a real strong scenario for a pretty nasty bull trap, to be honest with you. The reason why I say that is because if it bounces first up here to that 50% level or 618 level and then rejects, and then we know that Bitcoin is very likely going to come back down to this green moving average at some point, maybe it happens later on, like in early November. I don't know when it's going to happen, but if and when it does, that implies that this move, whatever the next move to the upside you're going to see, is likely going to be faded. It's not going to be a continuation of new all-time highs. Can I be wrong on this? Yes, absolutely. At the end of the day, all we do on this channel is look at statistics and probabilities, and I'm always going to bet on something that has a very, 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 very high probability to play out in that way. It's not always guaranteed, but again, if you don't understand these sort of things, then you're on the wrong channel, to be honest with you. and I'm not going to change my methods anyways until I find something better. So in this case, yes, if Bitcoin does bounce here and plays out this setup first, which I think is more likely to, then we have to seriously consider the implications of Bitcoin putting in a rejection around this region, because that is going to look like your traditional bull trap. And because that green 55 EMA is, still decently lower than price action currently at about 107.5, we could assume that Bitcoin's going to come back down to those regions. And that has other implications. Why? Because if we start to see Bitcoin really close below these levels, we're going to see the 5-day time frame setup fire off over here, and that's going to govern price a little bit lower, which can then bleed into the weekly time frame, which could be even lower than that, closer to $100,000 or maybe even a little bit below $100,000. Now we're getting way far out in advance. By the way, like I'm really fucking overshooting things here, and understand all of these sort of assumptions that I'm making. Here's the thing though. And this is where it gets nuanced, and this is where we're just going to lose all the fucking redax from this channel, but that's fine. We don't need them. I'm speaking directly to the people who actually understand this stuff and are actually making an effort to listen and learn. So in the event that we actually do see the 4-day time frame setup play out to the downside first and then bounce, at that point, I actually do think that it is a potential for a real continuation move to the upside. Maybe it'll take some time over time, but if Bitcoin first tests a 55 down here, fulfills that condition, and then bounces, then it's actually possible that, yes, we might see this thing, carry on with the upwards and onwards market. That's very possible. But like I said, based off of this setup right here, I think it's a lot less likely, not impossible, but just a lot less likely. Either which way, whichever way that this happens first, that is really going to govern what the sort of assumption as to, or at least a bias as to what happens next after that and what it essentially means. So just understand those two major sort of scenarios, I suppose. Anyways, of course, I do want to also center myself on the higher term timeframes here and just remind myself of some facts that make me do think that this is going to correct lower overall. The reason why I say this is because all higher term time momentum oscillators are on the same side here. And you know the rule if you've been on this channel for a long time now, in that whenever we see all the higher term timeframes align in a singular direction, it's better not to bet in the opposite direction. I'll just put it that way. You don't necessarily have to see it in the same direction, continuation move there, but just don't bet in the opposite fucking direction. I'll put it that way. Anyways, weekly time frame is showing downside momentum, also losing the bullish control zone for the first time in, a few months on the weekly time frame, as long as you're below 117,800, by the way. So that's, around your bull trappy regions of interest. The bi-weekly time frame is, this one's just heading down, unless Bitcoin more or less makes new highs. And that one is pivoted at 121 almost. This one's not closing this week, by the way. It closes at the end of next week. The 3-week time frame, I think, is more or less the same here. It is going to be pivoted maybe a little bit higher at 122,700. Again, coming in from a very, very high angle here, which has governed all of the major corrections that we've seen throughout this current market cycle. And then, of course, if we go to the monthly time frame, the monthly time frame will also turn down for the first time in a while if Bitcoin finishes this month out below 115. So a lot of these things remain to be seen. Obviously, we are just, right over the halfway point of October. But that does make me consider that if we see, if we see, I guess, the more bearish of these resolutions happen, I do think that there is legitimate downside for Bitcoin. Let's just call it somewhere around $100,000. Maybe it's a little bit lower than that. Maybe it's more closer to 90. I don't know what it ends up being, but I would be looking for corrective targets down around there. Keep in mind, we'd also, start to really confirm some bearish divergences on the higher term timeframes, of which the monthly right here would be, somewhat problematic, as it already does have a little bit going on. From these last couple of highs in July and more recently in September. And then, of course, when we go down to the weekly time frame, I mean, this is not like necessarily the best setup here. We got significant drives of bearish divergence on the weekly time frame and very, very low volatility. That would be certainly the more bearish interpretation of this, because that easily could lead towards a move lower. But I would imagine that, at some point after a bounce, assuming that the bounce plays out first rather than a test of the downside first, the likelihood of this thing coming down probably even a little bit below $100,000 is very, very likely. Does that make me full on bearish for the rest of the cycle and that the cycle is over? I don't fucking know. I mean, still, to be honest, it's still an uptrend on the monthly time frame. You still got higher highs and higher lows. That's very obvious. The weekly time frame would more or less basically be an uptrend. Yes, I know it'd kind of be ugly, but yeah, I would still consider that an uptrend. The bi-weekly time frame would be quite obviously still an uptrend as well. So I would still run with the assumption that, hey, this might just be another correction that lasts many months, which it already has lasted a few months, to be fair. And all the long-term corrections that we've seen throughout this market cycle have led towards long-term continuation to the upside. And that is a market feature of this current cycle. So I would actually not lean into bull market being over just yet, or at least look, I don't really care. I just take it one step at a time until I see something that's super, super conclusive. But yeah, we've seen this many times throughout this cycle. Bitcoin moves up, then trades sideways for, 5 to 7 months, then moves up again. Does the same thing over here. 6 months sideways, up again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6 months sideways, up again. 1, 2, 3, working on month number 4. What's another month or two sideways, and then perhaps another try to the upside, very late this year or very early in 2026. I think that's still possible, to be honest with you. But of course, always need to remain open-minded here, and well, I think that's probably a good place for me to leave off on this video. A lot of information on this one. This one was really for the TA nerds who have been following this channel, but when I do feel very strongly about something, I do want to go a little bit deeper into these sort of things. But yeah, again, really, really depends which of these happens first. Does Bitcoin fall to like 107 first, or does it rise to somewhere around here first? That is going to have major implications. Again, if it comes down to 107 first, I think that offers up the potential that Bitcoin could just, rally back onto new all-time highs from here. That's okay. That would obviously be a lot more welcomed, I think, for most people. Of course, if Bitcoin does rally from here without testing the downside first and playing out that 4-day setup, then I almost undoubtedly have to be looking at this rally, however high it gets, even to 120, as very likely a bull trap and likely to come back down at least to fulfill that test of the 4-day time frame. And again, looking at all of the other higher term time frames, it's really hard not to see that could be a correction that leads lower overall. So I do think that we're caught within, one of these kind of difficult times, because what's the worst thing for most people? Well, the worst thing for most people is just going sideways without really doing all that much. But even worse than that is going sideways and chopping around to both sides of the range, slightly breaking out here, slightly breaking down here, but not really having any major continuation. That is super death for a lot of the traders, of course. So anyway, speaking of trading, let's go check out the quantum wave bands. Quantum wave bands had a really good trade, longing basically the low of Saturday, and was in profit by like $5,000 or $6,000 actually from high to low. It actually ended up closing that at a small loss right here. It opened up the same position again. So I do think that still bodes well with a bounce out of this region before like any significant try lower. If we go to the strategy tester, just want to show again, long term, it's all about your edge long term. Yes, this thing has taken losses as Bitcoin does reverse from all-time highs. But again, when you play these things for the long time, you let these stats work out for you in your favor. And ultimately that equity curve continues to remain its beautiful trajectory up into the the right, which is what we absolutely love. Again, the quantum wave bands is something that we have that is really designed for a little bit more of the newer people out there in the world, because it gives you a training wheel sort of template as to what a working strategy looks like. You can customize it a little bit here and there, but it doesn't have like super crazy customization options. But I think that's good for newer people not to get like super in the weeds with stuff. That's what the Quant Prime is for. If you're really fucking into it, Quant Prime is for you. But for the newer people, I think this is a good one. Again, more or less just to make sure that you don't get fucking wrecked, tells you when to exit or when it's a good time to at least consider that. So yeah, you don't need to trade it exactly in the way that is postulated here, but I do think that just generally having it as kind of like a compass, kind of like a guideline, sitting next to you and keeping you honest if you are going to be trading the short-term timeframes, that is wise and generally a good decision. But yeah, anyways, that's where we'll end it for today. You can try this one out for free as well. By the way, in the link description below for Teachable, just find the Quantum Wave Bands link, and that is good to go. Other than that, I'm going to be wishing you the best as always. Take care, much love, and we shall be back on with another live stream on Friday morning. Very, very excited about that one. See you there or never again. No. See you hopefully next time.